What's going on with Vladimir Putin? I've tried to analyze the Ukraine conflict in the context of power politics. And power politics sets aside individuals. In fact, it even sets aside ideology. It just looks at the realm of large and small countries. It looks at the realm of realpolitik. And it looks at the focus on national interests, national self-interest. I've also touched upon psychological analyses of Putin, which I find interesting, although I'm also careful. I want to be careful not to sort of take them too far, because this idea that you're doing something solely because of your childhood trauma or because you are, in Putin's case, afraid of rats. I think that there's a limit to that, the value of that kind of explanation. Now, here's a different analysis. I would call it an historical analysis. It's coming from Paul Berman, who's one of the more astute students of American foreign policy. He wrote some very interesting things about Islamic radicalism and 9/11. And he broke with kind of liberal orthodoxy. He's writing as a liberal, but as a kind of a tough-minded liberal about radical Islam. Now, here's Paul Berman talking about, and he says, what is the Russian problem? This is an article, by the way, in the magazine called Foreign Policy, put out by the Brookings Institution. It's called The Intellectual Catastrophe of Vladimir Putin. A little bit of a misleading title, because we're not actually talking about just Putin himself. We're talking about the position in which the Russian leaders find themselves. And what Berman says is that the Russians have been facing a problem for a long time, in fact, going back to the 19th century. What's their problem? Well, they have a great history. They have a great culture and a great literature. And they also have an incredibly vast country, one of the biggest countries in the world. And so one would expect that based upon Russian size and Russian past glory, and also the sophistication of Russian culture, the Russians are very good at a lot of different things, from music to chess. Berman says you would expect the Russians to have formed a kind of successful government, a stable political system to match or to go along with their other achievements, but they sort of never have. And he goes back to the 19th century to say that even under the Tsars, Russia had created this kind of medieval aristocracy, this kind of empire, but an empire based upon mass serfdom that was technologically quite backward, even though it was culturally quite advanced. Russian weakness became apparent when Napoleon's forces invaded Russia. Here was a French army, you may say, bringing the French Revolution, not just the ideas of the French Revolution, but the kind of technological sophistication of Europe to Russia. And the result was that the French basically just mowed down the Russians. And suddenly Napoleon's troops were on the outskirts of Moscow. Now, the Russians began to sort of sulk over this. And says Berman, what did the Tsar do? He says, well, what the Tsar did was he decided, listen, I'm having a hard time trying to beat up on Europe or to establish my superiority over these advanced armies in Germany and France, or even the force of Great Britain. So I'm going to pick on some smaller countries and kind of whoop them. And sure enough, what Nicholas I does is he invades Poland and then he invades Hungary. And Berman's point is that these invasions are kind of demonstrations of Russian power, reflecting not strength, but a kind of weakness, reflecting not genuine pride, but a certain kind of humiliation, a desire to take it out on someone else. And, says Berman, if that seems like a kind of little tidbit of history, kind of uprooted from the present, he says, no, let's kind of follow the same track through Russian history. And let's look, for example, in the communist era. You have, going into the 1950s, Hungary begins to clamor for more independence. And what does Khrushchev do? Soviet troops come blasting into Hungary, the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. And then just over a decade later, exactly the same thing in Czechoslovakia, this time under Brezhnev, when you have a Czech uprising and the Czechs decide, listen, we're going to go out in the streets. We want more liberty of choosing our own jobs. We want more ability to speak our minds. In come Soviet tanks and crush the aspirations of the Czechs. And so this is kind of Berman's starting point for saying, now look at Putin. Now, admittedly, it's a great mistake to see Putin as just another czar. And it's an even bigger mistake to see Putin as sort of just another Brezhnev or just another Stalin. He's actually not. Putin is an old KGB guy, but he seems to be one who is broken with kind of strict communist ideology. He never appeals to it. In fact, he appeals to the opposite. The only thing that he takes from the communist era is a kind of anti-fascist posture. Now, I've talked before about how communism and fascism are actually ideological cousins, but ideologies that are cousins have often fought bitterly. Think, for example, about the Shia and the Sunni. They're very close in ideology. They've fought bitterly over the centuries. And so, nevertheless, in World War II, the Soviets developed this kind of anti-Nazi, anti-fascist rhetoric, and Putin has definitely absorbed that. But, says Paul Berman, Putin is in pretty much the same position. After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Russia becomes basically a big Canada. Yeah, Canada with nuclear weapons, but it's kind of this sort of society that's ignored, that's not given its pride of place in the kind of pantheon of nations. And so Putin goes, let me pick on some little country that's right in my backyard and kind of punch him in the face. And this will give me the kind of respect that I deserve on the world stage. So this is an attempt, as I say, to understand Putin, not in terms of his individual psychology, but the psychology of the leader of a humiliated nation that has not found its place in the world or in the sun and is trying to take by force the respect that is being denied to it on the basis of its own achievements.